Title: The apartment complex I live in is shrinking 1 inch every day. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins that at first no one noticed the change. A hallway felt tighter. A ceiling slightly lower. A door closer than it used to be. It was subtle. Easy to ignore. But then the measurements started to prove it. Exactly 1 inch, every single day. The apartment complex wasn't settling. It wasn't collapsing. It was shrinking. And the people still living inside it were running out of space. The apartment complex stood like any other aging building on the edge of a quiet city block. It was not particularly tall, not particularly old, and not particularly memorable. 5 floors of identical hallways, identical doors, identical lives stacked quietly on top of each other. From the outside, nothing about it suggested anything unusual. Inside, everything felt slightly off. It began with something so small that it barely registered as a concern. A resident on the 3rd floor noticed that the distance between his couch and the wall seemed shorter than he remembered. At first, he assumed he had moved the furniture slightly while cleaning. He adjusted it and thought nothing more of it. The next day it felt shorter again. On the 2nd floor, a woman realized her kitchen counters seemed closer together. The space between them felt tighter, forcing her to turn her body slightly to pass through. She blamed her imagination. On the 5th floor, an elderly man noticed that the ceiling above his bed felt lower. He could not explain why, but when he stood upright, his hand brushed against it more easily than before. He told himself he had simply grown used to the space differently. None of them spoke to each other about it. The changes were too small, too easy to dismiss. But they continued. Exactly 1 inch at a time. The building manager, a quiet man named Ellis, was the first to take it seriously. He had worked in the complex for over a decade and knew its structure better than anyone. When a tenant casually mentioned that her front door seemed harder to open, Ellis decided to inspect it. The frame had shifted slightly inward. Not enough to jam the door completely, but enough to create resistance. Ellis checked other units. Every door frame showed the same subtle inward pressure. He measured the hallway width with a tape. Then he measured it again the next day. The difference was undeniable. 1 inch. The walls were moving. At first, Alice assumed it was structural settling. Buildings shifted over time. Foundations adjusted. Materials expanded and contracted. But this was different. This was uniform. Every wall, every floor, every ceiling, all moving inward at the same rate. Exactly 1 inch per day. Alice contacted a structural inspector. The inspector arrived, examined the building, and left with a confused expression. There were no visible cracks. No foundation damage. No signs of stress that would explain such precise and consistent movement. The inspector suggested monitoring the situation. But by the time the next report was due, the building had already shrunk another inch. The residents began to notice more clearly now. Hallways that once allowed 2 people to pass comfortably now forced them to turn sideways. Doorways brushed against shoulders. Ceilings felt closer, pressing down in a way that made breathing feel slightly more difficult. Still, most people chose to ignore it. Leaving would require effort, money, disruption. And besides, nothing dangerous had happened. Not yet. On the 4th floor, a tenant named Marcus began documenting everything. He placed small marks on his walls, measuring the distance between them each day. He recorded the height of his ceiling, the width of his doorway, the space between his bed and the wall. Each day the numbers changed. Always by 1 inch. Never more. Never less. Marcus tried to warn others, but his concerns were met with unease rather than agreement. No one wanted to accept that something impossible was happening around them. The building wasn't collapsing. It was compressing. Deliberately. As if something unseen was tightening its grip. By the end of the first week, the changes could no longer be ignored. Furniture no longer fit where it once had. Beds had to be moved. Tables had to be repositioned. Closets became difficult to open. The hallways felt claustrophobic. The air itself seemed heavier. Ellis posted a notice in the lobby, informing residents that the building was undergoing structural evaluation, and advising them to report any unusual changes. The notice was removed the next morning. No one admitted to taking it down. By the 2nd week, the exits began to narrow. The front entrance door required force to open. The stairwell felt tighter, the walls pressing inward with each passing day. People began to leave. Some packed their belongings and moved out quietly, unwilling to remain in a place that felt increasingly unnatural. But not everyone left. Some couldn't. Leases, finances, or simple disbelief kept them there. And for those who stayed, the changes continued. Marcus's measurements became more frantic. He marked the walls multiple times a day now, as if expecting the pace to change. It never did. 1 inch. Every day. He began to notice something else. The objects inside his apartment were not shrinking, only the space around them. His bed remained the same size. His table remained the same width, but the room around them was closing in, pushing inward, forcing everything closer together. The building was not shrinking in the way one might expect. It was tightening, like a container being slowly compressed. Marcus tested something. He placed a glass bottle in the center of his room and marked its position relative to the walls. The next day, the walls had moved closer. The bottle had not. The space between them had simply decreased. He realized then that whatever was happening was not affecting the contents. Only the boundaries, only the structure, only the parts that define space itself. On the 3rd week, something changed. The movement did not accelerate, but the effect became more aggressive. Doors no longer just resisted. They warped. Frames bent slightly inward, creating pressure points that made opening and closing them difficult. Windows became harder to slide open. Some refused to open at all. The building was sealing itself, floor by floor, room by room. Alice attempted to contact authorities again, but reports were delayed. Inspections were postponed. Paperwork seemed to disappear or return incomplete. It was as if the building itself was being overlooked, ignored, as though something did not want attention drawn to it. The residents who remained began to feel the psychological weight of the situation. Sleep became difficult. Rooms felt suffocating. The constant awareness that the walls were moving created a quiet, persistent anxiety that never fully faded. Marcus stopped leaving his apartment. He spent his time measuring, recording, calculating, trying to predict how long they had before the space became unlivable. The numbers were simple, relentless. At the current rate, the rooms would become too small to stand in within weeks. After that, there would be no space left at all. One night, Marcus woke to a strange sensation. The air felt thinner. The ceiling above him felt closer than it should have. He sat up slowly. The room was darker than usual. The walls seemed closer than they had been just hours earlier. For the first time, the change felt immediate. Not gradual. Not distant. But present. Active. He reached for his measuring tape with shaking hands and checked the distance between the walls. The numbers confirmed it. The building had shrunk again. But this time, it had not waited for the next day. It had taken another inch during the night. Marcus looked toward his door. The frame had warped further. The gap between the door and the floor was nearly gone. The realization settled heavily in his mind. The pattern was changing. And whatever was causing the building to shrink was no longer following its own rules. The apartment complex was still getting smaller. But now, it was getting faster. By the 4th week, the building no longer felt like a place meant for people. It felt like something else entirely. The shrinking had stopped being a subtle phenomenon that could be measured and recorded. It had become something immediate, physical, inescapable. The hallways were now narrow enough that no two people could pass without turning sideways, pressing themselves against the walls just to move forward. Even then, their shoulders brushed the surfaces on both sides. The ceilings hung lower than they should have, forcing taller residents to tilt their heads slightly as they walked. The building was not collapsing. It was closing. Marcus had stopped trying to convince anyone else. The remaining residents had all reached the same understanding without needing to speak about it. The building was changing in a way that no normal structure should. And it was not going to stop. The stairwell became the first true barrier. What had once been a standard concrete staircase connecting all 5 floors had narrowed into something unnatural. The walls pressed inward from both sides, reducing each step into a tight, angled space that forced anyone using it to descend carefully. By the time the 4th week began, the stairwell could no longer be used safely. The walls had moved too close together. Anyone attempting to pass risked becoming stuck. The front entrance followed soon after. The door that once opened easily now refused to move at all. The frame had warped so tightly inward that it sealed the door completely. From the inside, it was impossible to force open. From the outside, no one seemed to notice. The building stood quietly on the street, unchanged in appearance. Cars passed. People walked by. Life continued around it without interruption. Inside, the space continued to shrink. The residents who had remained were now trapped. Marcus measured his apartment again. The numbers had become alarming. The distance between his walls had decreased to the point where his furniture no longer fit normally. His bed had been pushed against one wall, his table against another, leaving only a narrow strip of space for movement. Even that space was shrinking. The ceiling had lowered enough that he could touch it with his palm without fully extending his arm. The air felt heavier. Not thinner but compressed. As if the room itself was squeezing inward, reducing not just space but something less visible. Something harder to measure. Breathing required more effort than before. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to be noticed. Marcus began to understand something that made the situation worse. The building was not simply reducing physical space. It was reducing the capacity for that space to exist. The boundaries were closing in, and whatever remained inside those boundaries was being forced to adjust. To compress. To fit. He tested the theory. He placed his hand flat against the wall and pressed gently. The surface did not give. It pushed back. Not with the resistance of solid material, but with something stronger. Something absolute. The wall was not just there. It was enforcing its position. Later that day, something happened on the second floor. A resident attempting to leave their apartment became stuck in their doorway. The frame had narrowed during the night, reducing the opening to a point where passing through became difficult. The person had tried to force their way out. They did not succeed. The pressure from both sides increased steadily, slowly, until movement became impossible. No one could help. The hallway was too narrow to reach them properly. And even if it hadn't been, there was no space to pull them free. By the time the walls moved again, the doorway had closed further. The space where the person had been standing no longer allowed for any movement at all. After that, no one attempted to leave their apartments. The building continued its process without interruption. 1 inch at a time. Sometimes more. Marcus stopped sleeping. There was no point. Every time he closed his eyes, the room felt smaller when he opened them again. Time itself began to feel unreliable. Day and night blurred together as the only consistent measurement became the distance between the walls. The lights in the building began to fail. Not all at once, but gradually, room by room, floor by floor. Darkness spread through the structure, leaving only faint sources of light from windows that were becoming harder to reach. Marcus's apartment was one of the last to remain lit. He sat on the floor, surrounded by furniture that had been pushed together by the shrinking walls. There was barely enough space to stretch his legs. The ceiling hovered just above his head. The walls were close enough that he could touch both sides by extending his arms. The numbers told him there was not much time left. He stopped measuring. There was no longer any need. The outcome was inevitable. What mattered now was understanding why. Marcus pressed his ear against the wall. At first there was nothing. Then faintly something emerged. A low, steady pressure. Not a sound. Not a vibration. But something that could be felt more than heard. It came from within the walls. From beyond them. From the space that was no longer there. The realization formed slowly. The building was not shrinking on its own. Something outside it was pushing inward. Not from one direction, but from all directions at once. As if the building existed inside something else. Something that was closing. Something that had begun to tighten its hold. The walls moved again. This time Marcus felt it happen. There was no delay. No gradual shift. The space reduced instantly. His shoulders pressed against both sides of the room. The ceiling lowered further. His breathing became more difficult. Not because of lack of air, but because there was less room for his chest to expand. The building had stopped pretending to move slowly. Now it was finishing what it had started. Across the complex, the remaining spaces vanished one by one. Rooms that once held entire lives were reduced to narrow gaps. Hallways disappeared. Doorways sealed. Every inch that had once existed was being taken back. Marcus tried to stand. There was not enough space. He shifted slightly, pressing himself sideways between the walls. The pressure increased. It was constant now. Unrelenting. There was nowhere to move. Nowhere to escape. The realization came with a cold clarity. The building had never been shrinking. It had been consumed. Space itself was being removed, piece by piece, until nothing remained. The final inches disappeared faster than the rest. There was no longer a distinction between walls, floor, or ceiling. Only pressure. Only confinement. Only the absence of space. And then, there was nothing left at all. From the outside, the apartment complex still stood exactly as it always had. 5 floors. Identical windows. Silent hallways. No visible damage. No signs of collapse. Just another building on a quiet street. Unremarkable. Unchanged. Except for one detail. Every window was now completely dark. And no one inside would ever be seen again. Some places don't fall apart. They don't burn down. They don't collapse. They simply stop making room for you. If you ever notice your walls feeling closer than they should be, or your ceiling just a little too low, don't wait to measure it, because by the time you realize what's happening, there might not be enough space left to escape. Subscribe for more stories that get closer every time you listen.